It's always seemed to me little short of scandalous that we know so little about, I think, the Japanese director who's probably the most important and the most accomplished in the history of Japanese cinema, and that's Ozu. When the films first began to come out to European audiences in the 1960s, when they've been revived, everybody remembers just how wonderful they are, but somehow we've never really accorded him, I think, in the West, particularly in America, the honour that he deserves. It's not only that his life encompassed such an extraordinary period of cinema, from 1927 until his death in 1963, but that he brought an extraordinarily original sensibility. A man who was in love with cinema from the very beginning. And that shows through if you're lucky enough to see the early films, as well as the late masterpieces like Tokyo Story. This is a man who just was in love with the whole business of making movies.
Ozu was born in Tokyo in 1903, and his father was a salesman of fertilizer. So he was a son of the new merchant class, in a sense, in the Meiji period of Japan. He was, in that sense, a product of the modern age, since I don't think his father's job would have existed even 20 years earlier, probably. He was a difficult child, frequently in trouble. He didn't get on particularly well with his father, but did become very close to his mother, with whom he in fact lived until he died. He never married. And he entered the film business in 1923, the year of the Tokyo earthquake, the great Kanto earthquake, when Tokyo was pretty much destroyed, on the recommendation of a family friend. He was somebody who was besotted with American films from early childhood. And since he had no aspiration to follow in his father's footsteps selling fertilizer and was crazy about movies, and since the Japanese film industry was developing apace at this time in the early 20s, a family friend recommended him for a job as an assistant cameraman with the Shochiku company, and he entered Shochiku on a fast track, as it were. He didn't have to go through the entrance exams or other things that the company normally expected from its new employees, and found himself part of the team.
His talent in writing good script was noticed, but it was very important at Shochiku Studio that any directors have to write good screenplay. So he was eventually promoted from assistant director to a full director and began to make films, mostly comedies, at Shochiku Studios. I believe that he made 53 films in his life. 52 films were about contemporary life and mostly about family life.
Tokyo Story is what studios in Japan called in the 1950s, and the directors who worked there, home dramas, which I suppose we'd probably call soap operas. And indeed the story behind Tokyo Story is perhaps no more than the kind of soap opera in which an old couple in retirement, he's been a kind of local official, come north to spend time in Tokyo with their children, who they haven't seen for a while. There's a doctor, Koichi, his sister Shige, who runs a hairdressing salon, and perhaps the most interesting of the figure, Noriko, who was married to their son who died in the Second World War. And while they're in Tokyo, they're shuttled around between the children, partly because the children are far too busy getting on with their own things. It's an example of kind of filial and daughterly selfishness. They're eventually shuffled off to Atami, a resort just a little bit south of Tokyo. And not surprisingly, the old couple feel they've had too much, eventually decide to go home, though content it seems. And then there's a sort of stroke of melodrama because the old mother, the old lady, has some kind of attack halfway home. And eventually when she does get home, she falls seriously ill and she dies, leaving in a moment of intense pathos at the end of the film, the old man alone without his wife.
The most moving part of the film, I believe, is that the parents accept it as part of reality in life. The parents just accept it, and everything is portrayed in very subtle way with a lot of humor, but with irony too. So Tokyo Story is a very complicated film, but it's a beautiful story as well.
One of the most troubling sequences in Tokyo Story is when the old man turned out for the night, goes off to find his friend Hattori, and Hattori brings another friend, and the three of them, elderly men, sit in a bar with a mama-san at the side, and they get spectacularly drunk, and they begin to contemplate the extraordinary changes that have taken place in their society, and above all, they talk about their children and how, in a sense, their children have disappointed them. And I think what's happening here is those observing, I don't think commenting, but observing on the way in which the traditional relationships between fathers and children, between parents and children, have somehow inevitably been sundered. In a Japan which has only just recovered from the disastrous defeat of the Second World War, in a Japan where only recently the Americans, as the occupying power, have departed, having left them, Japan that is, a brand new constitution, where everybody wants to be American. They want to go out and play pinball games, they want to wear American trousers, they want to wear American clothes. That whole solidity of family somehow has been lost.
Ozu, over the years, and particularly from the 1940s onwards, refined his style to a very large extent and decided consciously and knowingly to cultivate a style that was his own, distinctively his own. He wanted to have a style that was recognizably his own. And he did this by dropping much of what we think of as the standard vocabulary of film language and storytelling in film. He did away with most of moving camera work. He did away with fades to black and up from black. He did away with dissolves from one image to another image. And he preferred instead a fixed camera angle, often, although by no means always, from quite a low angle, because many of his scenes concern domestic interiors where people are sitting around in a domestic space of some kind and exchanging opinions or having a meeting of some kind. And in those occasions, the camera is routinely placed quite low at about the height of a person's eyes if they're sitting on a tatami mat floor.
In a way, there is something, I think, deeply traditional and something very Japanese about the way he composes each frame. And again, this is part, I think, of the richness of Tokyo's story. I suspect that the starting point are those great Japanese woodblock prints from the 19th century and indeed the 18th century, and one thinks of Utamara particularly, and the way in which in those woodblock prints as it were, the plane of reality is organized in a way that's quite unlike Western perspective, Western narrative art. So that we find, for example, in an opening sequence when the old couple are planning their trip to Tokyo, behind them, we see through the house, there's a window and people are walking by and one neighbor comes by and looks in and suddenly the whole frame changes, not from the frame we're watching in the cinema, but to the frame of the neighbor in the window as she says to them, "You are lucky going to Tokyo to see your children." Now, I think that's very Japanese, out of a Japanese tradition, but I think in a way the West understands all of that because it's precisely that sort of framing device that we find in the paintings of the post-impressionists, Van Gogh, Matisse and so forth, all of whom had been profoundly influenced, of course, by Japanese woodcut prints when they'd come to Europe.
He has a number of quirky idiosyncrasies. One is his categorical refusal to follow the Hollywood convention of eyeline matching. When two characters talk to each other and you cross-cut from one to the other and back to the first one, it is standard to do it at a slightly oblique angle and with what is called an eyeline match, which establishes the continuity of the space between the two of them and tells the viewer that they are indeed sitting facing each other and indeed talking to each other. It's a kind of code that has become well established in Hollywood cinema since the 1920s. Ozu categorically rejects that by insisting on direct frontal stares. So his characters typically face the camera directly, square on, and he cuts through a series of angles that bear no relationship at all to the convention of the eyeline match. So people, in effect, stare at each other directly in the way that, perhaps with their eyes slightly lowered. Stare is the wrong word because in a Japanese conversation the eye is traditionally somewhat dipped. A frontal stare is considered rather rude, but the camera's stare at them is frontal, even if their stares at each other are not quite frontal in that sense. So Ozu cross-cuts between one shot and another shot of people speaking to each other, in which the two shots are basically the same shot. It's just a different person in exactly the same position, pretty much. And that is, I think, a clue to one of the things that Ozu does in storytelling visually. Ozu is interested in matching shapes. So most of Ozu's editing doesn't follow the standard rules of continuity. Instead, it follows his own very idiosyncratic schema of matched shapes and matched patterns, matched motifs. So for him, a conversation scene with two people speaking to each other is best expressed through two shots of the two speakers, which are essentially identical shots or compositionally very similar shots, which he cross-cuts together, thus emphasizing the similarity of the two speakers and the two shots.
People talk about Tokyo Story being a quietist film, and I suspect what they reach for is some sense of Japaneseness. And I'm always reminded by those who said to one interviewer that when Americans don't understand something Japanese, they say it's Zen. And I think what he was really saying was, this isn't particularly Japanese, there's something larger going on here. And that's my sense. This film sits in the middle of the 1950s. It seems to me to relate in a way to what was happening in Italian cinema, neorealism. It's about a humanist cinema that values the way we actually live our lives in detail. In a way, it's a kind of counterblast to the great period of the 30s and the 40s, the great ideological period of the 20th century, with fascism competing against communism, in which ideas, beliefs, mass movements have somehow swept away the simplicity of ordinary human emotions between people. And also, I think, is reminding us, perhaps as he always did through his career, that in the end that's the locus, that's the heart of what humanity is all about. At the end of the film, when the old woman says to her husband, "Isn't life disappointing?" You might think that was an immensely sad message, but he turns and with a seraphic smile just smiles at her. And it may be disappointing, but nonetheless it's rich and varied and complex and magical in a way.
みたいにお医者さんかあんたがのお医者さんになるこらおばあちゃんおるかの
The moment in the film when I think people start reaching for their handkerchiefs is the moment when the old couple in Tokyo really realise there's nowhere for them to go one night. And the old man decides he'll go off to meet a man called Hattori, who he once knew, and enters into a kind of wonderful drinking competition. He comes home spectacularly drunk. The old lady goes off to spend the evening with Noriko, the daughter-in-law. And I think that's an extraordinary tender scene, because this girl is not a member of the family, and yet she is the most daughterly of all, as it were, the family that we see in this film. And what I find almost unbearable is that she massages, as it were, her mother-in-law's back, this old lady, this kind of monumental, almost statue-like old lady. She just massages her back. And then she says with such delicacy, "Why don't we go to sleep?" And it's that sense of tenderness, I think, that really moves me there. And there's a later moment in which this girl, Noriko, who is clearly unable to decide whether she should get remarried, which is what any modern girl would do, or whether she should stay as she ought to as a traditional Japanese widow, remembering the man who was killed in the war, blurts all this out and talks to the old man after his wife has died, when she comes south for the funeral. And suddenly, as her real feelings bubble up like lava, anybody who thinks that Ozu is incapable of conveying strength of emotion should look at that sequence, because it's immensely powerful and, again, deeply affecting. It's a wonderful performance all the way through by Noriko. This was an actress who, when Ozu finally died, decided she would never want to work again. She could only work with him, and she simply retired from the screen.
It's about family, about life, but the realization, somewhat bitter realization that life could be disappointing, but we have to accept that. But it also shows many different kinds of human nature. The parents are betrayed, somewhat betrayed by their own children, but they are saved by somebody else who is married to one of their children. But even this daughter-in-law, at the end of the film, admits to the father that she sometimes forgets about his late husband, and she's not a very good person. And so it's a very beautiful film, because it's very much about human frailty.
I think it's to be regretted that we really know so little about Ozu as a director. And we know really so little about the great sequence of masterpieces, including Tokyo Story, that he makes in the 1950s and up to his death in 1963, because it's a reminder of something that we've entirely lost sight of in terms of cinema. It's a reminder that there wasn't always an American cinema, that the global version of cinema promoted by Hollywood didn't always run the world. There were great national cinemas that grew out of the common shared language that all of us have through the cinema, but nonetheless reflected and dwelt upon their own particular cultures.